If we look back at the record of this administration compared to previous administrations, we see that this is by far the worst record, leaving us with record deficits. In fact, this president has set a record for the 5 highest deficits ever. Maybe we could put that chart up. 5 highest deficits on record are part of this president's legacy.
We're going around the world with a tin cup, having to borrow to finance our own deficits.
Conduct hardly becoming a superpower. We now pay more in interest to foreign investors than we pay out in foreign aid. The 3 top countries holding American debt: Japan, China, and the United Kingdom. Last year, 96% of America's debt, which was sold on financial markets, was bought by foreign investors. They are not just buying American, they are buying America. The numbers are big, the solution simple.
The only way you get our house in order, there's only a couple of simple ways. You got to cut spending, and you got to look at revenue and just match the revenue with the spending, and we're not doing that as a country, and we're frankly living on borrowed time.
Well, there is a sense that we're living on borrowed time here and that there is going to be some sort of a crunch or crash at some point. What I don't get is all of the conservatives principally are so worried about our national sovereignty, they're even worried about being part of the UN, and that they let Asian bankers control basically our economy. You can't afford to offend your creditors.
$482 billion. That's how much the U.S. government is expected to be in the red. In other words, how much more the government is spending than it is taking in. And add that to the debt, what the U.S. already owes, $9.5 trillion. And some say that's a recipe for financial disaster.
Earlier, the Senate blocked an amendment to look at the impact of foreign-held debt, even though most of the government's debt is held by foreign banks.
The entire war in Iraq has been paid for with borrowed money. We're borrowing money from China, India, Saudi Arabia, Mexico to finance this war.
It could be the perfect crime.
Japan.
You are spending $10 billion a month in Iraq alone. It goes up another $2 billion to $12 billion a month if you add in Afghanistan and all the other international anti-terror efforts. So, keeping them honest, we decided to look at how else we might use that $10 billion a month. A state-of-the-art high school like this one being built in Seattle, Washington, can cost $75 million. $10 billion would buy 133 of them. Let's say a local public hospital isn't keeping up with growth. A major expansion and upgrade can cost over $100 million. $10 billion would get you 100 of those.
Trying to do some calculations here. I mean, $160 billion is, which is about 1 year of this war in Iraq, is equal to the entire budgets of the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Justice, including the FBI and the entire federal judiciary, Interior, Energy, Treasury, the Environmental Protection Agency, NASA. I mean, that's everything here in Washington. That's everything out in the field. I mean, we are spending a huge amount of money, and to put all this on our credit card with no accountability, with no plan to pay for it, I think is the height of irresponsibility.
And this brings the total tab for Iraq and Afghanistan for this year alone to $200 billion.
It would be one thing if it were $200 billion a year, but the end was in sight. But there really is no end in sight.
And where does the money come from? The short answer is we're borrowing it. The national debt is now creeping on $9 trillion.
Larry, they got us $9 trillion in debt now. These two parties, trillion. I can't even fathom what a trillion is.
So here's what $1 trillion is. If I pay Dr. Qatari $1 million a day since the year 1, since the year Jesus Christ was born, that would not total $1 trillion.
Since Nixon took us off the gold standard in the early 70s, $9 trillion. So if there's 300 million Americans right now, that means we all owe $30,000. So a family of 4 would owe $120,000 to get us out of debt. Larry, if you did that in the private sector, you'd be in prison, you'd be put in jail. And yet, they get away with it running our government. Enron, WorldCom, ring a bell?
Using schemes like Fat Boy, Death Star, and Get Smarty, Enron created artificial shortages, bypassed regulatory protections, and drove energy prices sky high. At the time, there was no regulation of Enron's trading in energy derivatives. There was no public disclosure requirements and no record-keeping requirements. There were no anti-fraud or anti-manipulation provisions. Basically, there was absolutely no oversight whatsoever, and what was there was removed. And what happened is that Enron and other companies took advantage of this lack of regulation and oversight. So, Dr. Greenspan, in retrospect, do you think you were right to oppose these efforts to regulate energy derivatives?
I generally remember the issue, but I'd have to go back and refresh my memory, and if I may, let me look at it and come back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you.
And I'd be delighted to do so.
Alan Greenspan yesterday and this morning, the Philadelphia Inquirer, ex-Fed chairman concedes a mistake. New York Times has on the front page, looking back in disbelief, with a photograph of the 82-year-old former Fed chairman. And the Washington Times, Congress rips Greenspan for crisis. Now onto your phone calls. Allentown, Pennsylvania, Democrats line. Your reaction?
Well, I think he's a phony, sir. 20 years in that business, and they just laugh and smile. I would just watch that program before C-SPAN, and they talk about it like it's just far removed. They're all removed. The people that were in charge, they won't take responsibility for it. And now the average people and people on fixed incomes are unable, even though they don't have one of those kind of mortgages that they're talking about. They're blaming it all on a sub-market, the loans that they loaned out, that people weren't eligible for them, but that's not the only people that are going down. There's a lot of other people going down because the cost of living has gone beyond their means.
Inflation is very simple. When government arbitrarily, out of thin air, prints money, creates money and credit out of thin air.
Where does it come from? The government has no money. Well, can we tax people? No, can't tax anymore. What are they going to do? They're going to print the money, devalue the dollar, and that's the problem we have. The dollar's low, prices are high, the people are suffering, the middle class is shrinking, so we offer the same old pablum, the same old baloney, and then we turn around and we say, well, why don't we ask the Federal Reserve to create more money? Nobody seems to have enough money. If we just had more money, maybe it would prop up the stock market. So we go to the Federal Reserve and they badger the Federal Reserve and the markets say, we need more money, so they crank it out. They lower interest rates. You can't lower interest rates unless you print more money. So they lower interest rates dramatically, like never before.
Dr. Paul, you're raising an issue which a significant number of people have been raising over the years, and for which, frankly, we're not quite sure what the answers are.
Question is, would he take $10,000 and put it in a box and keep it for 20 years, or would he take a couple of gold coins and put them in a box for 20 years? Believe me, 99% of the American people, they'll take the gold. They will not bet on the value of the dollar.
And in our Constitution, the only measure of a dollar was a certain weight of gold or silver. So we had an accurate unit of measure. So I just ask, what should the word dollar mean in today's world? What is the meaning of the word dollar?
It should be a unit of value which over time is stable, although cyclically it goes up and down. So that long-run inflation is zero, and sometimes it's positive, and sometimes it's negative, but over the long run, it's flat. That's what it should mean.
The Federal Reserve has destroyed 98% of the value of the purchasing power of the dollar since 1913, and in the meantime, they finance every war that they couldn't have financed if they were on the gold standard.
Certainly a massive amount of money for the war ends up in a black hole.
Number two, we have an archaic financial regulatory structure that came in place a long time ago after the Depression. It really needs to be rebuilt.
After the crash of 1929, credit froze solid. Back then, as the economic picture darkened in the run-up to the Great Depression, President Hoover's administration was slow to react, believing that the economy would correct itself. 785 banks closed the first year. By 1932, 5,000 banks had gone broke, and the remaining banking system was tottering. Millions who had never gambled in the stock market lost their life savings anyway because their bank accounts weren't insured. Money simply evaporated. The depths of the Depression were reached in the years 1932 and 1933. Along the way, many American families sank from prosperity to poverty.
President Roosevelt, by marshaling the untapped powers of government, has pulled America out of the Great Depression. FDR orders every bank in the nation to close for 4 days. 4,000 insolvent ones never reopen. In an unprecedented move, he restocks the rest with newly minted money. The government is intervening in the economy like never before. $2 billion is printed and shipped out to the banks. He boosts government spending and delivers a landmark labor law. In June 1938, the minimum hourly wage is set at 25 cents. The working week, a maximum of 44 hours. And soon, both employment and production have recovered.
America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
This administration must and will preserve the present gold value of the dollar. We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them.
Mr. Greenspan's critics say that he encouraged the bubble in housing prices by keeping interest rates too low for too long, and that he failed to rein in the explosive growth of risky and often fraudulent mortgage lending. Next call is from Norwich, New York on the Independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. I think that a 20-year mistake is unforgivable. I mean, most of us make a mistake and we correct it, but to have 20 years is a crime. And these guys are putting on a great show. They're not Democrats, they're not Republicans, they're internationalists. They only have their own banking interest and the international banking interest in mind. And they give us a good show, and these committees come over and they invite them in. It's almost like having a script to go in there. And as the gentleman from Allentown said, you know, these guys here are they're in it for their own game, and America is going to go into either a deep recession, which is better known as a depression. The business people may call it a cycle, but the fact is it's going to be a depression.
Because the U.S. for the second time had committed a fraud and created more receipts for gold than there was gold. It's that simple. And then finally the markets sort of sensed this, and Nixon was forced to take us off the gold standard, because if he had paid out gold until it got to zero, Once we couldn't pay on some of those dollars, the entire worldwide monetary system would have collapsed.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system.
And on August 15th, 1971, all the world's currencies became fiat currency. I don't know why the rest of the world didn't rush out and hang him, but they didn't. They just all went along with this.
It's a war profiteer's economy, fanned by the forced draft of American money. They counted a good year in Saigon when the prices only go up by 25%.
Years of American presence and the tens of billions of US dollars that came with it had transformed much of South Vietnam, creating a false economy that was utterly dependent on that presence becoming perpetual.
Since the U.S. began its big buildup in the mid-60s, millions of dollars worth of goods have entered the country each month. Some economists say 10% or more of the cargo is diverted into black market channels.
In the 1970s, during Vietnam and Watergate, Americans had to confront a painful reality. Their government had lied to them on a very grand scale. And maybe the government had lied about the Kennedy assassination, too.
The pattern that we have now established for Lee Harvey Oswald is obviously the pattern of a man being run by the CIA. There's no question.
But I am trying to tell you that there is no question as a result of our investigation that an element of the Central Intelligence Agency of our country killed John Kennedy, and that the present administration is concealing the facts. There is no question about it at all.
The agency's new director was really a Soviet mole. A Soviet mole. A Soviet mole. 6 CIA directors came and went, while the head of counterintelligence ruled unchallenged. Angleton believed that the KGB was orchestrating a worldwide, all-encompassing manipulation to undermine the West. He called it the Master Plan. He believed no one could see through the web of disinformation woven by the KGB. Angleton was so afraid the CIA would be tricked into recruiting KGB double agents that he essentially blocked the recruiting of any Soviet agents. He oversaw another CIA FBI operation that opened and read the mail of American citizens for many years.
What was your understanding of the legality of the covert mail operation?
That it was illegal.
What?
That it was illegal.
That it was illegal.
The press revelation that Angleton had spied on American citizens created a furor. He had compounded his problems by suggesting that William Colby, the agency's new director, was really a Soviet mole. In 1974, Colby called the counterintelligence chief into his office and fired him. Angleton stood by the master plan, which by now his critics were deriding as the monster plot. The agency's new director was really a Soviet mole. A Soviet mole. A Soviet mole.